Hello, everyone. My name is Raven, and welcome to Raven67854 Gaming, and welcome to my Godot 4 tutorial on Global Illumination inside of Godot 4. And we're going to be looking at two methods that exist inside of Godot. So previously, in a previous video, we used Voxel GI. And Voxel GI requires pre-baking, and while it does allow for dynamic global illumination from like emissive materials and so forth, again, it's defined by a volume. And SDFGI and SSIL are not constrained by, well, any of that. Basically, you just make your level. You make sure that your assets are marked static, which in this version, I think it was Godot 11 and onwards, they're always marked static. So unless you change it or turn it off, it's always going to be there, which is very nice, by the way. And, of course, SDFGI stands for Assigned Distance Field Global Illumination, and SSIL stands for Screen Space Indirect Lighting. Okay, so let's take a look at the scene, and then we'll start talking about SDFGI, and then we'll talk about SSIL, and a whole bunch of stuff. There's a lot to cover here, and I don't want this video to be too long. So it's a pretty basic scene. I mean, I used some windows. There's a weird artifact in there, but can't do anything about that. And I do have bloom on, by the way. That's why these are glowing like that. And yeah, I picked some questionable materials, but they do showcase what we're going to be doing, because SDFGI not only does global illumination, but you also get some somewhat decent reflections for your static objects. Like if you have a wall and it's never dynamic, never going to be destroyed or anything like that, you can get some pretty decent reflections out of it, which is actually quite nice. Okay, so first things first, let's turn on SDFGI and let's wait for the probes to update. And as you can see, we have some decent reflections. And notice, unlike SSR, which is screen space reflections, it actually takes into account everything. So as long as you're within range of the volume, it can calculate, the reflections on objects on the other side of the room and so forth. And I know it's very splotchy. We will look at that. Okay. So. And as we move, you'll see that it kind of bounces a little bit. So let's take a look at the first option. Of course, the first option is enabled, which turns it on. The next option is use occlusion. You use this to help prevent light leaks. But in the case of this scene where the walls are thick, the walls are very thick. We don't need it. And if you do turn it on, it can actually introduce like more dark splotches. So for this scene, we don't need it, but you may, and that's something I want to preface before we go forward. Like all these settings, there is no perfect, number to turn on typically. You're going to want to, adjust this for every scene or, whatever you happen to be making. It's going to have to be unique to your situation. And the next is read skylight. Now, read skylight basically takes the environment like the skybox, whatever kind of sky you happen to be using, whether it's just a solid color or it's a physical sky, a procedural sky, or some kind of HDRI map. It will take that into account. Now, if you turn it off, it's basically interior lighting. So it didn't really do a whole lot in this scene. Actually, I'm going to try to zoom in way out and then zoom in way back in. And the reason for that is sometimes that will make the probe in the editor to recalculate. It did affect it a little bit, like particularly off in the distance there. You can actually see it. But in this particular scene, it didn't do too much. But if you have like some kind of interior, like, if you're making a game that only takes place inside of a building, you may or may not want the skylight. So again, it depends on the situation. Bounce feedback is the energy multiplier applied to a light every time it bounces off of a surface. So, and one thing I definitely want to preface or say with this is, values greater than 0 effectively simulate multi-bounce lighting. But if you set it higher than 0.5, you create the void of, white, which, we'll showcase here. This is just beautiful. Look at this. This is just, this is our game now. you know? So you probably don't necessarily ever really want it to go over 0.5. It depends on your scene too, but if you have any form of light, it will affect it. And again, this is something that we'll probably be able to see better down the hallway, but on this scene, lowering it doesn't seem to do a whole lot. Just a little bit. There's not a lot of light here, but again, try not to go over 0.5. Cascades is the view distance of the SDFGI volume. And basically, the more cascades, the further out it renders. And like we can set this to 4. And you'll see in this scene, it affected a little bit, but due to the size of this, it's not going to affect it all that much. And so if you have like a large open world, you're probably going to need 8 cascades. But if it's more smaller interior, you can probably get away with 4, which will save a little bit on memory and so forth. The minimum cell size is the cell size of the closest SDFGI cascade. Lowering it, you can improve the SDFGI quality at the expense of more performance and higher update time, which means that you can get more stuttering. So because SDFGI is actually done in real time and it's not pre-baked like anything like Lumen or anything like that, well, there's no pre-baking involved. Lumen is real time. It just does a bit of pre-baking with the meshes, but that's not what we're talking about. But because SDFGI does everything in complete real time, if you have like a really fast moving camera, you'll get some popping and some stuttering as it's trying to generate and update the volumes, but you're outpacing it. Supposedly this is something that's going to be worked on in continuous versions of Godot 4, and I have no doubt that that is the case, and of course newer techniques will be developed and so forth. But as it stands right now for Godot 4.0, this is a problem that you will have to be aware of, and you may want to just use SSIL or write your own method, or depending on what kind of game you're doing, you may end up running into this issue, and you may have to come up with unique ways to get around it. Of course, higher values render quicker and they cover far more ground. So like if I set this to 0.1, you'll see that it did get a lot more splotchy actually. This is because the cells are a lot more accurate. But if I set it to say like 1, it smoothens out quite a lot actually, like quite a lot. And adjusting your cell size can be, very important. Again, like I've said, I think a couple times now, you need to adjust this based on whatever your scene is. And also, of course, it will adjust the max distance and, of course, the cascade 0. So I'm going to set this back, and you'll notice that the max distance is a little different as well. Cascade 0 distance, all that is how far out Cascade 0 renders, and Cascade 0 is your highest quality cascade, and each subsequent one is of lower quality. And the max distance is calculated based off of it adjusts based on your cell size and your Cascade 0. So I tend to I don't usually adjust the max distance, but depending on what you're going for, you may need to do that. And all that is how far out SDFGI is rendered. Your Y scale is your verticality of your probes, and lowering it will pack your probes much closer together and will increase vertical quality. And, setting it to 100% will make it very sparse. In a scene like this, it makes very little difference. But in scenes where you had a lot of verticality or something like that, it might make good sense to put it at, say, compact instead. Again, as always, this is something that is very scene dependent. So you'll have to, adjust this, as needed for your scene. The other option, the last of the 3 here, energy, is the brightness of the SDFGI. I typically adjust all lighting with the lights and the emissive materials. I usually do not touch this, but in certain cases, it can be useful to, say, double the brightness, for example. Depends on what you're going for. Again, adjust it per your scene. The normal and probe bias. They increase effectively. If you increase them, they'll lower visual streaking artifacts, but they'll increase light leaks. So you kind of have to pick and choose. Do you want more light leaks, or do you want less visual streaking artifacts? And like if I set this to 2, you'll notice that it's sort of adjusted over here, but it gets a little brighter. And if I set the probe bias to 2, you'll see that things do update. This is not really the greatest scene, but if I like way crank this up, like way crank it up, you'll start to see how it starts to like bleed and so forth. Same thing with this one here. If we like really crank this up, like let's go kind of wild with it. Yeah. Like I mean, it's very smooth now. But this is probably not what anyone wants. Okay. So now that we've talked about all the settings in SDFGI, which by the way is found in the world volume, I should have said that originally, but that's where it's found. But let's go into project settings and let's scroll down to global illumination and let's talk about some of the other options. So one of the other options, of course, is use half resolution. And basically that just renders the GI at half the screen resolution. And this can introduce light artifacts around like the edges of polygons, your meshes and so forth. But it can also massively boost performance. Now I'm getting quite a bit lower performance because I'm recording and so forth. But that pumped it up about 30 to 40 FPS just rendering at half resolution. And you can see the light artifacts. At way higher resolutions, because unfortunately this machine is only at running at 1080p. But like on my workstation, which runs at 4K, when I turn on this, it typically has far less visual artifacts. But again, it's a trade-off. Now, the next set here. So you notice it's very splotchy. So probe ray count is the amount of rays that are calculated between each probe. Frames to converge. Basically, this is if you set it to say 30, it'll have higher quality but significantly more latency because it'll take more frame time before it converges everything together, your volumes and so forth. And if you crank it down here, you'll see that it's less latency. In other words, it updates much faster. It updates the volumes much faster, but as you can see, the quality is a little lackluster there. And frame to update the lights is basically how often it checks to update the lights. Because remember, like when your lights move and the brightness, both indirect and direct light changes, that will affect the SDFGI volume. And so I typically just leave that alone. Now, probe ray count, if we set this to slowest, it's going to slam the performance way down. But you'll see that it actually updates pretty good. Like, it's very smooth now. We have a lot of rays. And it's rendering extremely slow. And if we turn on use half resolution, it doesn't even hardly affect it because of how many rays it is. But the default, I believe, is 16. And if we set it to 32, you can see that gets rid of a fair bit. And 64, that also gets rid of a fair bit. 96 really starts to. And 128 is where it like really shines. But like even 32 does a pretty good job. I'm going to set this back to the default there. Now, the next is the SSIL. And we're going to turn this on. And you'll notice it kind of darkens the edges a little bit. And, did not mean to turn that off. And you also see that it does affect. So SSIL is used as, well, of course, it's screen space. So it only takes into effect whatever the camera sees, which is actually normal rejection here will actually assist you with that. Normal rejection is the amount of rejection used when it's calculating the SSIL. So it helps reduce light leaking with SSIL. And if you turn it off, emissive objects like these spheres won't really matter. But like if the other side of the sphere was actually emissive, but this side wasn't, it would actually try to calculate that light bouncing. Now, much like with SSGI found in Lumen, SSIL is here to assist with the more finer detail of the global illumination. And it can add a fair bit of pop depending on your settings and so forth. And I'm going to go back and run down this hallway again, and you can see the probe. Like, you can see the cascades updating here. Like, you can see as it moves and tries to keep up with the speed that I'm using. Now, there are ways, of course, to fix this, and also I'm going to eventually show you the debug tools that allow you to visualize your cascades and your probes. But let's get back to SSIL. So the radius, of course, it's the distance mount lighting can travel when using SSIL. So higher values will allow light bounce to go further, but you can get a lot more visual artifacts. Case in point, you notice when I cranked it up to 16, it got a lot brighter around here. It also got darker in certain cases. And you can also crank up the intensity as well, which can help smoothen it out some, but these are grossly increased to very absurd amounts you would probably never use. The sharpness, so this is the SSIL effect is allowed to blur over the edges of objects. So basically, if you set it really high, you'll get aliasing around the edges. And if you set it too low, it'll make objects really blurry. So like if we lower it, probably won't notice it too much in this particular scene. But yeah, you're not really going to notice it too much in this scene. I probably should make a better scene just for SSIL. And of course, the last option we already talked about, which is normal rejection. Now, fortunately, SSIL does have its own set of quality options. And if you go into project settings here and we go back to environment, we have quite a few. So right now, SSIL is only set to medium. And if we set it to ultra preset, it doesn't really change too much visually. But that effectively increases the number of samples that it uses per frame. And of course, half size functions basically much like the GI half resolution. It renders it at half resolution. It increases performance to run it at half resolution. And you will get a little bit of artifacting if you run it at half size. But typically, the higher resolution, you can get away with this. This is quite useful for optimizing, and you can see a little bit of the effect there in the corner. It gets a little better with it off. Now, adaptive target is only used with ultra, and what adaptive target does is it tries to adjust the quality when it's set to ultra. So if you set it to 0, it gets a similar value of, say, medium, I believe, and one provides higher quality than all the other settings at a greatly increase to performance. And I say greatly, I put that in quotes, but it does depend on scene performance. Now, blur passes, it'll have, the more passes you have, the smoother it will be at the expense of performance, and you'll lose some of the high frequency detail. So if you like really crank this up, we don't really see too much of a difference here. I really should probably build a better scene for SSIL. But again, this is only to provide a bit of screen space indirect, and SDFGI is doing all the grunt work. This just kind of fills in a bit of the gaps. And the fade out from and to, so this is at the 50, so 50 units away from the camera, it'll start fading out SSIL, and the final fade out to, that's the final fade out. So when it hits 300, it will no longer affect the scene. And you can decrease and increase this. And, because it's screen space, if you had something like really far away, you obviously don't want that affecting your screen. So you really don't want this too far out. You want it, rather close to the player or the camera as possible. And that is it. That is everything that, involves SDFGI. And of course, these materials here, let's talk about these really quick. All they are is an albedo that's set to the same color as the emission, and we can adjust the energy. Now, you notice when we adjust the energy, so far, nothing's really happening. And sometimes what you have to do is you have to zoom way out. You notice the frame rate tanks because it's trying to keep up. And then when we zoom back in, ta-da, it's updated the volume. Sometimes SDFGI can take a little bit to update. And this is where you know, having you know, adjusting your settings in here can greatly affect it. So I'm just gonna set that back. I can't. 5 is woo, not good, not good. And as well, like I said in global illumination here, the mode, it's already set to static, which is one reason why I didn't show it, because in all versions of Godot, it's already going to be static. But this is where it's found. You can disable it completely. You can set it to dynamic so that it only affects, you know, well, that only works with Voxel GI, and we've covered that in another video. And of course, we're just going to leave this at static, and I'm going to get out of there. And oh boy, I started clicking on things, and now I've clicked on everything. There we go. Okay, so that's it for this video. If you guys have any questions, comments, whatever, do put them down below. And don't forget to join the Discord, because the Discord is much easier for me to provide help and so forth. But if you have a question, feel free to dump the comment down below. As well, if you'd like to support this channel, and as well get some pretty cool perks like early access to videos, custom Discord stuff, and so on. And there's other stuff coming in the future as well. Become a YouTube member. You can hit that join button, you know, support the channel. And there's also a link in the description for becoming a member. And of course, the final thing I would like to say, don't forget to subscribe, hit that bell so you actually get notifications. And I will see you guys in the next one. Thank you for watching. Have a good one. And yeah, see you guys in the next one.